Park ranger finds Bigfoot wounded. It was breathing and it blinked at me. A veteran park ranger thought it was just another night patrol. Illegal campfires, empty campsites, nothing unusual. But then, deep in the Colorado he found something slumped against a boulder. It was massive, covered in matted hair, and when his flashlight hit its face, it blinked. He called for backup, but by the time anyone arrived, the clearing was empty. No body, no blood, no tracks, just silence. Was it a wounded animal? Something hiding that knows how to cover its own trail? Or proof that an impossible creature is alive in our forests? If Bigfoot was real, would they ever let us know? You being here means more than you know. If your heart still makes room for wonder and gentleness, then you're already one of us. I've spent 23 years as a ranger with the U.S. Forest Service. All of them here in Colorado's San Juan National Forest. The job becomes part of who you are. After so long, the daily routines, the changing seasons, the quiet satisfaction of protecting these ancient mountains. My name is Thomas Riker, and what I'm about to share happened in the autumn of 1997. Though I've spent years debating whether to put it on record, I've handled everything from lost hikers to wildfire suppression, from illegal hunting operations to search and rescue missions in whiteout conditions. My fellow rangers know me as someone who keeps his reports dry and factual. No embellishments, no dramatic flourishes, just the essential details needed to document an incident. That's probably why I've hesitated to file anything official about what I encountered that October. Some things defy simple documentation. The San Juans are magnificent but unforgiving. At over 11,000 feet in elevation, the weather can turn deadly in minutes. I've seen experienced climbers make fatal mistakes, and I've helped recover what was left of them. The forest doesn't care about human error. Nature operates by its own rules up here. That particular autumn had been unusually mild. The aspens held their golden leaves longer than normal, and the first serious snows were running late. Most of our seasonal staff had already transferred out, leaving just a handful of us, year-round rangers, to patrol nearly 2 million acres of wilderness. I didn't mind the solitude. After 2 decades on the job, I preferred the quiet season. My daily rounds that October mainly involved checking on the handful of remaining campers and making sure the closed facilities were properly winterized. The trails were empty more often than not. Even the wildlife seemed subdued, as if the mountains were slowly exhaling before winter's grip took hold. I kept my standard gear with me: service revolver, radio, topographic maps, compass, and my well-worn field notebook. The radio coverage was spotty in the deeper valleys, but I knew the terrain well enough to work around the dead zones. When you've spent as many years as I have in these mountains, you develop an instinct for their rhythms and moods. The morning of October 15th started like any other late-season patrol. The air had that crisp, clean edge that comes with autumn at elevation. Frost coated the ground in shadowed areas, though the forecast promised afternoon temperatures in the mid-50s. I checked my logbook from the previous day. Only 3 registered campers in the entire district. All of them experienced backpackers on extended trips. What stands out in my memory now is how normal everything felt. I'd filed thousands of routine reports over my career, documenting everything from bear activity to trail maintenance needs. Nothing in my training or experience had prepared me for what I would encounter in the coming days. Looking back, I can see the subtle signs I missed: the unusual quiet, the lack of small game, the way the wind seemed to carry unfamiliar sounds. in the twilight hours, but that morning I was focused on my usual duties. I needed to check on the Palmer Creek campground's water system before the first hard freeze, and then sweep the high country trails for any stragglers who might not be prepared for the approaching winter weather. Standard procedure, nothing remarkable, just another day in the life of a Forest Service ranger. I remember thinking how the job had changed over the decades. When I started in the mid-70s, we didn't have GPS units or cell phones. Navigation meant knowing how to read the land and sky. Even now, I trust my compass and topographic maps more than the electronic aids. Technology can fail, but the mountain's landmarks remain constant. That's the context you need to understand what follows. I'm not someone given to flights of fancy or wild speculation. My reputation in the service is built on reliability and attention to detail. What I encountered that autumn challenged everything I thought I knew about these mountains and the creatures that call them home. The call from my supervisor came just as I was finishing my afternoon paperwork. 3 separate hikers had reported seeing smoke from unauthorized campfires in the Wheeler Basin area, a remote section about 15 miles from the ranger station, with the fire danger still high despite the cooling temperatures. Any report of illegal burns required immediate investigation. I know it's getting late, Riker, my supervisor said, but you're the closest ranger to that sector. Can you check it out before full dark? I glanced at my watch, 4:30 in the afternoon. Mid-October meant sunset around 6:15, giving me less than 2 hours of reliable daylight. I'll head out now, I replied. Should make it to the first reporting location with some light left. I gathered my standard patrol gear, service weapon, radio, flashlight with spare batteries, first aid kit, and my field citation book. Added an extra layer of clothing since temperatures would drop quickly after sunset. The topographic map showed Wheeler Basin as a horseshoe-shaped valley, thick with old-growth pine and bounded by steep ridges. 3 known backcountry campsites were marked, though plenty of flat ground existed for off-trail camping. My Forest Service truck handled the rough access road well enough. I'd driven these mountain tracks thousands of times over the years, knew every washout and boulder. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the trees, and I spotted the usual wildlife mule deer browsing in small clearings, a red hawk circling overhead, the occasional flash of a snowshoe hare darting into cover. At 5:45, I parked at the Wheeler Basin trailhead and shouldered my pack. The air had that peculiar autumn clarity that makes distances deceptive. Sound carried differently to the crunch of pine needles under my boots seemed louder than usual, while the typical forest background noise felt muted. I'd investigated countless illegal campfire reports before. Usually, it meant citing some careless weekend campers or explaining fire regulations to out-of-state visitors. The process was routine. Locate the fire site, document any damage, collect evidence of the responsible parties, and assess if any fire suppression was needed. The first reported smoke sighting had come from near Copper Creek, which joined Wheeler Basin from the north. I kept a steady pace along the main trail, scanning the surrounding forest for any signs of recent human activity. Fresh boot prints in the muddy sections, broken branches, toilet paper behind trees. People always left signs if you knew where to look. As the daylight faded, I clicked on my flashlight, but kept it pointed downward to preserve my night vision. The temperature had dropped into the low 40s, and my breath formed small clouds in the beam of light. Normally at this hour, I'd hear owls beginning their nightly hunts or the rustle of small nocturnal mammals in the underbrush. But something felt off about the forest's rhythm. The usual evening sounds were absent, replaced by an unnatural stillness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. In 23 years of patrols, I'd developed an instinct for when things weren't right. Every experienced ranger knows that feeling when the forest itself seems to be trying to tell you something. I paused to check my location against the map. The first reported smoke sighting should be just ahead, in a small clearing near the creek junction. My watch showed 6:30. Full darkness would arrive in minutes. Standard procedure said to mark the location and return at first light if conditions weren't safe. But I wanted at least a preliminary look at the site. The beam of my flashlight caught something unusual on a tree trunk about 30 yards ahead. I approached carefully, keeping my light steady on the mark. Years of field experience had taught me to recognize the signs left by bears, elk, and other local wildlife. But this was different. A deep gouge in the bark, about 7 feet up the trunk, with what looked like coarse, dark hair caught in the splintered wood. I moved closer to investigate the clearing, where the first smoke sighting had been reported. My flashlight beam cut through the growing darkness, revealing a crude fire ring made of scattered rocks. The ashes were cold, but recent, probably within the last 24 hours. Whoever had camped here hadn't bothered to properly disperse the ring or pack out their trash. I found 2 empty beer cans and a crushed packet of ramen noodles partially buried under some leaves. As I knelt to examine the fire pit more closely, I became acutely aware of how quiet the forest had become. October evenings usually brought a chorus of great horned owls establishing their hunting territories, or the rustling of pine martens in the canopy above. But now there was nothing. No wind in the trees, no distant calls of wildlife, just an oppressive silence that seemed to press in from all sides. Then I caught it, a peculiar odor that didn't belong. After more than 2 decades in these woods, I'd learned to catalogue the normal smells: wet earth, decomposing vegetation, the sharp scent of pine sap. This was different, musky and organic, like rotting meat mixed with wet fur, but somehow worse. My first thought was a dead elk, probably taken down by mountain lions. We'd had several cat kills reported in the area over the summer. Made a note in my field book about the smell and the unusual silence. Even if it wasn't directly related to the illegal campfire investigation, any significant changes in wildlife behavior were worth documenting. The light was failing fast now, the forest beyond my flashlight beam becoming an impenetrable wall of darkness. That's when I heard it, a sharp, hollow sound echoing across the valley. At first, I thought someone might be chopping wood, though that would have been unusual at this hour. But the rhythm was wrong. The knocks came at regular intervals, about 10 seconds apart, and seemed to move from one ridge to another. Knock, pause, knock, pause, knock. Each impact had a distinctive quality, like a baseball bat striking a hollow tree, but far louder than any woodpecker or falling branch could produce. I switched off my flashlight and stood perfectly still, listening. The knocks continued there. Steady pattern, but now they seemed to be coming from multiple directions. One series would sound from the ridge to my north, then another would answer from the southern slope. The sequence was too regular, too deliberate to be random forest noise. In all my years of service, I'd never heard anything quite like it. My radio crackled to life, making me jump. Ranger Riker, base checking in. Everything okay out there? I keyed the mic, keeping my voice low, though I couldn't explain why. Riker, here. Found one abandoned fire ring near Copper Creek Junction. No active fires or immediate hazards. I hesitated, then added, getting some unusual acoustic activity up here. Any other rangers or work crews in Wheeler Basin tonight? Negativi. The dispatcher replied, You're the only one logged in that sector. Want me to send backup? Another series of knocks echoed through the darkness, closer this time. The hairs on my arms stood up despite my jacket. No, I said after a moment. I'm going to document this site and head back. We can do a full survey tomorrow in daylight. Copy that. Check in when you're back at your vehicle. The radio fell silent, leaving me alone with those rhythmic knocks and the lingering musky odor. I turned my flashlight back on and quickly photographed the fire ring, collecting the trash as evidence. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from just beyond the reach of my light. Something that was using those knocks to communicate across the valley. I shouldered my pack and moved deeper into the basin, following an old game trail that wound through stands of aspen and lodgepole pine. The terrain grew increasingly rugged. As I descended, with loose scree slopes and thick patches of mountain mahogany that grabbed at my jacket. My flashlight beam caught glimpses of deer tracks and elk droppings, normal signs of wildlife, but the forest remained unnaturally quiet. The knocking had stopped about 15 minutes ago, leaving behind a silence that felt almost expectant. I'd done enough night patrols to know how darkness can play tricks on your senses, but something about this evening felt fundamentally wrong. The musky odor grew stronger as I approached a seasonal creek bed where early autumn rains had left patches of damp soil between the rocks. That's when my light caught something that made me stop dead in my tracks. There, pressed clearly into the soft earth, was a footprint unlike anything I'd encountered in 23 years of forest service. My first thought was bear, but the shape was all wrong. It showed distinct toe impressions and a pronounced arch, more like a massive human foot than an animal's pad. I knelt down for a closer look, placing my own size 12 boot beside it for scale. The print dwarfed mine, both in length and especially in width. I pulled out my field kit and began documenting the find according to protocol. First, photographs with a ruler for scale, then detailed measurements. The print measured 17 inches from heel to toe, with a midfoot width of 8 inches. The depth of the impression suggested whatever made it carried substantial weight. What struck me most was the anatomical detail: 5 distinct toes, a ball, arch, and heel. That suggested a bipedal gait. There were more prints heading downstream, each stride measuring roughly 6 feet. The pattern indicated a smooth walking gait rather than the loping movement you'd see with a bear. I followed the trail carefully, photographing the clearest examples and noting their position with my GPS unit. I'd brought a small plaster casting kit, standard issue for documenting evidence in the field, but quickly realized it wasn't adequate for prints of this size. I only had enough material to capture about 3/4 of one impression, focusing on the toe and ball area where the detail was sharpest. While the plaster set, I continued examining the surrounding area, finding several broken branches high up on the surrounding trees, well above what a bear could reach, even standing upright. My training kept me methodical, pushing down the growing sense of unease. There had to be a rational explanation, perhaps someone playing an elaborate hoax with carved feet, though the remote location and the precision of the anatomical details argued against that. The stride length alone would make such a hoax extremely difficult to execute, especially in this terrain at night. I recorded my observations in my field notebook, being careful to stick to facts rather than speculation. Multiple bipedal prints observed in creek bed. Consistent stride pattern suggesting single individual. Prints show clear anatomical details, including toe differentiation and arch structure. Size and depth inconsistent with known wildlife or human origin. The plaster had set enough to carefully remove from the ground. Even with just a partial cast, it was the most substantial piece of physical evidence I'd collected. I wrapped it carefully in my spare shirt and stored it in my pack. Whatever had made these prints was still in the area. The impressions were fresh, with crisp edges that hadn't been eroded by the light drizzle we'd had earlier in the day. I found myself checking my radio more frequently, making sure I still had a clear signal to base. The rational part of my mind, the part that had handled everything from lost hikers to mountain lion attacks, kept working through possible explanations. But another part, something more primitive, recognized that I was tracking something that shouldn't exist in these woods. The tracks led me deeper into a stand of old-growth timber, where the canopy grew so thick that my flashlight beam seemed to hit a wall of darkness. I moved cautiously, keeping my breathing steady despite the growing tension in my chest. The footprints were harder to follow here on the needle-strewn ground, but occasional broken twigs and disturbed vegetation gave me a direction. The musky odor had become overwhelming, reminding me of wet fur and something else I couldn't quite place, something almost human-like but wrong. My radio crackled softly at my belt, the static a reminder that I wasn't completely alone out here. I checked my position on the GPS unit. I had descended about 800 feet from where I'd first heard the knocking. That's when I saw it, against a massive granite boulder, partially obscured by the shadows of overhanging branches, was a form that made my breath catch in my throat. At first, my mind tried to make sense of it as something familiar, a bear maybe, or a trick of light and shadow. But as I steadied my flashlight beam, the shape resolved into something that defied easy categorization. It was slumped against the rock face, easily 8 feet tall, even in its crouched position. The body was massive, covered in what appeared to be dark, matted fur. What struck me most wasn't its size, though that was shocking enough. It was how human-like its posture was, the way its shoulders hunched, the positioning of its arms. It wasn't the posture of any animal I knew. I could hear its labored breathing, ragged and wet-sounding in the stillness of the forest. My light caught its chest, rising and falling in an uneven rhythm. Then, and this is the moment that will stay with me until the day I die, I saw its eye, one large, dark eye, surprisingly human-like, slowly blinked in the beam of my flashlight. The intelligence in that gaze froze me in place. This wasn't the blank stare of a wounded animal. There was awareness there, recognition. My hand shook as I reached for my radio, never taking my eyes off the creature. I had to swallow twice before I could find my voice. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Riker." I kept my voice low, though I knew whatever this was could hear me clearly. "Go." "Ahead, Riker," came the response, slightly fuzzy with static. "I'm going to need immediate support at my location." I paused, struggling with how to describe what I was seeing. "I've got what appears to be an injured, large animal. I can't make a positive identification at this time. Can you clarify the type of animal, Ranger?" The creature's eye was still fixed on me. Its breathing seemed to grow more labored. "Negative." "Dispatch, it's..." I swallowed hard. "It's unlike anything I've encountered before. Large bipedal subject, approximately 8 feet in height. I need wildlife services and medical support if available. There was a long pause from dispatch. When the voice came back, it was different, older, more authoritative. Must have been Lieutenant Wheeler taking over. Ranger Riker, please confirm your GPS coordinates and maintain your position at a safe distance. Do not approach the subject. I repeat, do not approach. Support is being mobilized. I read off my coordinates, double-checking them against my unit. The creature hadn't moved, but something in its breathing pattern had changed. It seemed more alert now, its eye tracking my movements with unsettling precision. Copy that. Dispatch. I'm maintaining position at approximately 40 yards from the subject. Please advise estimated time for support arrival. The radio crackled with Wheeler's response, but I was focused on the creature's eye again. There was pain there, yes, but also something else, something that made my skin crawl with its implications. Recognition, assessment, calculation. I kept my position, watching the creature while waiting for backup. The minutes stretched like hours in that dark clearing, my flashlight beam unwavering on the massive form. Its labored breathing continued to fill the silence, but something was changing. The breaths were becoming more controlled, more purposeful. 20 minutes passed before I heard the first sounds of approaching vehicles. The creature's eye widened slightly at the distant rumble of engines. As headlights began to filter through, the trees, casting strange shadows across the boulder, the massive form shifted. Despite its apparent injury, it moved with surprising fluidity. In the chaos of moving lights and shadows, it seemed to simply melt into the darkness between one blink and the next dot. By the time boots hit the ground and flashlight beams joined mine, the boulder stood empty. Deputy Martinez arrived first, his hand resting casually on his sidearm as he surveyed the scene. The younger ranger, Peterson, followed close behind, his fresh front-training eagerness dampened by obvious nervousness. Location of your subject, Ranger Riker? Martinez asked, his tone professional but carrying an undercurrent of skepticism I'd come to expect in situations like this. It was right there, I said, moving my light across the boulder face, against the rock, slumped down, breathing heavily. Couldn't have gone far in its condition. Peterson swept his beam in wide arcs across the clearing while Martinez approached the boulder. I watched as he examined the surface and the ground around it with methodical precision. No tracks that I can see, Martinez announced, crouching. To study the soil. Ground's pretty firm here, though. Might not hold prints well. I moved closer to where the creature had been. That musky scent, now mixed with something else, a metallic temps that reminded me of old pennies. There's still an odor, I noted. Can you smell it? Peterson sniffed the air tentatively. Just smells like forest to me, sir. Maybe a little musty. Martinez straightened up, brushing dirt from his knees. Found some broken branches over here, he said, pointing his light at a cluster of snapped twigs about head height. Human head height, that is. Could have been wind damage, though. We had that storm last week. I knew what this looked like. 30 years of service, and here I was describing an 8-foot-tall creature that vanished, without a trace. The skepticism in their expressions was professional, polite, but unmistakable. You've been pulling double shifts this week, haven't you, Tom? Martinez asked, his tone careful, almost gentle. End of seasons, always rough on staffing. I know. What I saw, I replied, but even as I said it, the scene felt increasingly surreal. The empty boulder, the quiet forest, Two fellow officers, trying not to look too concerned about a veteran ranger's state of mind. Peterson was scribbling in his notebook, probably more out of procedure than necessity. "Should we organize a search pattern, sir? Try to track which direction it went." Martinez shook his head slightly. "Ground's too hard for tracking. And if it was injured but mobile enough to leave, it's probably long gone by now." He turned to me. "We'll note the location and alert wildlife services to keep an eye out for any unusual activity in the area." "Standard protocol." I nodded, suddenly feeling every hour of my double shift. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving me drained. But underneath the exhaustion was something else, a gnawing doubt that had nothing to do with questioning what I'd seen. Rather, it was the growing certainty that something intelligent had been watching me the entire time, testing me, maybe even communicating in its own way. "I'll need to file a full report," I said, mostly to fill the awkward silence. "Of course," Martinez replied. "Take your time with it. Maybe get some rest first." The three of us stood there for a moment longer, our flashlight beams crisscrossing the empty clearing. The forest had returned to its normal nighttime sounds, crickets chirping, an owl calling in the distance. Everything was perfectly normal, except for the fading metallic scent and the image of that intelligent eye burned into my memory. I couldn't sleep that night, and by dawn I was back in my truck, heading toward the clearing. The morning light painted everything differently, but I knew the route by heart now. 30 years of patrolling these forests had taught me to trust my instincts, and something about that encounter didn't sit right. Not in the way my colleagues assumed. It wasn't doubt I was feeling, but rather a certainty that I needed to look closer. I parked at the same spot and gathered my gear: camera, evidence bags, sample containers, and a fresh notebook. The morning air was crisp, carrying the first real bite of winter. Weather Service had been warning about an incoming storm system, but I figured I had a few hours at least. The boulder looked smaller in daylight, more ordinary. I photographed it anyway, marking the exact spot where I'd seen the figure. The ground told me nothing new, too hard-packed to hold prints. But as I widened my search pattern, working in careful circles around the clearing, I noticed something through the trees that I'd missed in the darkness. About 40 yards north of the boulder, partially hidden behind a stand of aspens, stood a crude structure. At first glance, it could have been storm debris, but as I got closer, the deliberate nature of its construction became clear. Branches had been woven together to form a lean-to, the kind of shelter that would keep rain off, but allow airflow. This wasn't random windfall. The weaving showed purpose, with thicker branches forming a framework and smaller ones filling the gaps. I photographed everything from multiple angles, paying special attention to the joining points where branches had been twisted together. No tools had been used. This was all done by hand, by very strong hands, given the thickness of some of the broken branches. That's when I noticed the leaves. At first, they just looked wet, darker than the others scattered around, but when I crouched down for a closer look, I saw the distinctive reddish-brown stains. Blood, not much, just small streaks on 3 or 4 leaves near the lean-to's entrance. Whatever had been breathing so heavily by the boulder had rested. Here too, I carefully collected the leaves, placing them in a sealed evidence bag. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The forest wasn't silent like the night before. Birds were calling, small animals moving through the underbrush, but something felt off. Like the wildlife was performing normalcy rather than actually being normal. Back at the station, I logged everything according to protocol. The photos, my detailed notes, and most importantly, the blood evidence. My supervisor reviewed it all. With that carefully neutral expression I'd come to recognize over the years, the look of someone trying to balance professional courtesy with institutional skepticism. "I'll make sure this gets to the lab," he said, sealing the evidence bag in an envelope. That was the last I saw of it. 2 weeks later, when I asked about the results, he told me the samples had been lost in transit. Just one of those things. "That sometimes happens," he said. "Paperwork gets mixed up, items get misplaced. These things happen by then. It didn't matter much anyway." The storm I'd felt coming that morning had turned into the first major system of the season. 8 inches of snow fell over 2 days, transforming the landscape into an unbroken white expanse. When I finally made it back to the clearing, the lean-to had collapsed under the weight of the snow. The blood-stained leaves, if there had been any more, were buried or decomposed. All that remained was my memory of that intelligent eye watching me through the darkness, and the certainty that something far more complex than any known wildlife had built that shelter. The days after finding the lean-to blurred together. October was winding down, and my patrol routes became increasingly solitary as the last seasonal staff departed. I kept to my usual schedule: morning equipment checks, afternoon patrols, evening reports, but something had shifted in the forest. Or maybe in me, it started with footsteps. 3 days after the snow, I was checking a trail near Beaver Creek when I heard them, a steady crunch of snow behind me, maybe 30 yards back. I stopped. The footsteps stopped. I waited 10 seconds, then continued. The steps resumed, maintaining that exact distance. This happened 4 more times before I finally turned around, my flashlight beam cutting through the early evening shadows. Nothing but pristine snow and silent trees. I wrote in my logbook that night, October 1997, footsteps following on Beaver Creek Trail, approximately 1700 hours. No visible tracks upon investigation. Snow conditions, powdery, -12 degrees Celsius. 2 days later, I was ascending a steep section of the Morrison Trail, when rocks started tumbling down the slope behind me, not the usual scatter of pebbles you get from melting snow or small animals. These were deliberate, like something large was moving parallel to my path, just out of sight above the ridgeline. I documented that too, along with the time, weather conditions, and my exact location. The breathing was the worst. It started as something I could almost convince myself was just wind through the pines. A rhythmic whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. But as the days passed, it became more distinct. I'd be checking a campsite or documenting trail conditions, and there it would be, deep, controlled breathing from just behind the nearest stand of trees. Never close enough to pinpoint, always gone when I investigated, but undeniably there my logbook filled with entries. October 27th, breathing sounds observed near Junction Camp, duration 3 minutes, no visual confirmation. October 30th, heavy footsteps following for 0.8 miles on Sawmill Route, snow too crusty for clear tracks. November 2nd, rocks displaced on Morrison Ridge, pattern suggests deliberate movement. Collected samples of disturbed soil. I found myself caught between my training and my instincts. The ranger in me wanted evidence, photographs, measurements, something I could submit in a report without looking like I'd lost my edge. But another part of me, the part that had spent 3 decades reading these mountains, knew I was being watched, studied, maybe even tested. I started carrying my camera everywhere, ready to document anything unusual. But the presence was too clever for that. It seemed to know exactly how close it could get without giving me proof, how to stay just beyond the reach of my flashlight beam or just behind my peripheral vision. The rational explanations grew thinner with each encounter. Wind doesn't follow you for miles, maintaining a consistent distance. Animals don't systematically test your reactions, and nothing in these mountains breathes with that kind of measured intelligence. My supervisor noticed the growing stack of incident reports on his desk. He never questioned them directly, but I could see the concern in his eyes. 30 years of solid service, and now suddenly I was filing daily observations of something that danced right along the edge of credibility. I kept my entries professional, stuck to the facts, times, locations, observable phenomena. But in the margins of my personal logbook, I started noting patterns. The encounters never happened before noon. They increased in frequency near water sources, and they always maintained that 30-yard buffer, close enough to observe, far enough to vanish if approached. The doubt was there, of course. How could it not be? But it wasn't doubt about what I was experiencing. It was doubt about how long I could keep documenting these encounters without either catching something conclusive or being quietly asked to take some time off. The night of November 5th brought me to the old Cedar Creek cabin, a remote outpost we mainly used for equipment, storage, and emergency shelter. The temperature had dropped to -15 degrees Celsius, and protocol required checking our remote locations before the real winter storms hit. I'd done this particular check hundreds of times over my career, usually finding nothing more exciting than mouse droppings or the occasional blown fuse. I set up my tent outside rather than sleeping in the cabin itself, another habit from years of service. Better to hear approaching wildlife or spot smoke from illegal campfires. The clearing around the cabin offered good visibility, with the structure at my back and open sight lines to the tree line about 40 yards out. The evening routine was automatic: check the cabin's supplies, radio and my position, heat up some soup on my camping stove, and settle in with my logbook. The forest seemed quieter than usual, but that wasn't unusual for the season. Most wildlife was either migrating or preparing to den up for winter. It was 2:17 in the morning when I woke to complete stillness. Not the natural quiet of a winter night, but that same unnatural silence I'd experienced weeks ago, as if something had muted every cricket, every rustle of wind through the pines. I lay perfectly still in my sleeping bag, ears straining. First touch was so light I almost missed it, just a brush against the tent's outer wall, like someone running their hand along the fabric. But then came another, more deliberate, pressing inward enough to dimple the material. Whatever was touching my tent was solid, massive, and moving with precise control. I could hear it breathing now, not the ragged panting of a bear or the quick snuffling of an elk, but deep, measured breaths that spoke of intelligence and purpose. Each exhale sent warm vapor through the tent fabric. I could see it condensing in my flashlight beam, which I kept pointed at the tent ceiling, afraid to move it. The presence shifted, and I felt rather than heard it settling into a crouch. Beside my tent, the breathing continued, steady and controlled, close enough that I could have reached out and touched whatever was there through the thin barrier of ripstop nylon. My own breath seemed thunderous in comparison, and I forced myself to maintain a steady rhythm despite the hammering of my heart. For 7 minutes, I checked my watch later. We stayed like that, separated by less than 2 feet of space, and a single layer of fabric. Then, with deliberate slowness, it stood. I felt the movement as a change in air pressure, a sense of mass rising up and up until it must have been towering over my shelter. One final exhale, this one carrying that same metallic, musky scent I'd noticed before, and then it retreated. The sound of its departure was minimal, just the soft crunch of snow under something heavy, moving with surprising grace. I waited until the forest's ambient sounds gradually returned before even considering movement. When I finally did emerge, flashlights sweeping the clearing. Dawn was just beginning to grey the eastern sky. I spent an hour documenting everything I could find. The snow around my tent showed signs of disturbance, but nothing clear enough to photograph or cast. A few dark hairs caught on a nearby branch disintegrated at my touch, like spider silk. That metallic scent lingered until the morning breeze dispersed it. My hand shook slightly as I made the entry in my logbook, but I kept the language clinical and precise. November 6th, 1997. 0 to 17 hours. Close encounter at Cedar Creek Cabin. Subject maintained physical contact with tent for approximately 7 minutes. Breathing observed. No usable tracks or physical evidence recovered. I considered filing an official report, but could already hear the responses. Exhaustion, dream state, maybe a curious elk or bear. Without concrete evidence, this would just be another mark against my credibility. So I closed my logbook, packed up my gear, and kept this one to myself. After that night at Cedar Creek, I knew I needed someone else to verify what I was documenting. Someone outside the Forest Service chain of command. Deputy Mark Sanderson had worked several poaching cases in the area over the years, and I'd always found him to be thorough and level-headed. More importantly, he wasn't the type to dismiss evidence just because it didn't fit a convenient narrative. Called him from a payphone in town rather than using official channels. "Mark, I've got something unusual I'd like you to look at. Off the record, if possible." He agreed to meet me at Miller's Diner, a quiet spot where rangers and law enforcement often grabbed coffee between shifts. I brought my field pack containing the plaster cast I'd managed to preserve and some photographs from my trail camera, the only physical evidence I had left after my supervisor's handling of the blood samples. The cast wasn't perfect. The soil had been too damp for ideal conditions, but it captured enough detail to show this was neither human nor any known wildlife print. 18 inches long, with a distinctive mid-tarsal break and clear dermal ridges along the toe impressions. I'd wrapped it carefully in bubble wrap and kept it in a sturdy box. "I've seen a lot of bear tracks in my time," I explained as Mark examined the cast under the diner's fluorescent lights. "This isn't that. Look at the heel definition, the way the toes spread. Whatever made this was bipedal." Mark turned the cast over in his hands, his expression neutral but attentive. "Weight distribution suggests something heavy," he noted. "You find any stride patterns?" The ground was too soft to preserve a clear sequence, but I've got these two. I slid across several grainy photos from my trail camera. Most showed nothing but shadows, but one frame captured something massive moving between trees. The image was blurred. These weren't the high-resolution cameras we have today, but you could make out a distinct outline, too tall and broad to be human. Mark studied the photos, longer than I expected, occasionally glancing up at me as if gauging my sincerity. Finally, He gathered everything back into my pack with careful precision. "Let me take these for a few days," he said. "I know some people who might be able to help analyze them properly." I hesitated, but handed over the evidence. If there was any chance of getting official validation, it was worth the risk. Mark promised to be discreet and contact me directly with any findings. A week passed before I heard from him. The meeting was brief, back at the same diner. He returned my pack, without ceremony, sliding it across the table while keeping his voice low. "Results came back inconclusive," he said, "not quite meeting my eyes. Print could be multiple overlapping impressions. Photos don't show enough detail for analysis." But something in his tone felt off. Too rehearsed, too dismissive. I'd known Mark for 15 years, worked dozens of cases with him. This wasn't his normal analytical approach to evidence. "Who exactly analyzed these?" I pressed. "That's confidential," he replied, standing up to leave. He hesitated, then added, "Look, Tom, you've got a solid reputation. Don't push this one too hard. Some things are better left alone." I watched him walk out, that familiar knot of frustration tightening in my gut. The evidence was still in my pack, but something told me it had been altered or tampered with. When I examined the cast later, the finest details, those crucial dermal ridges, appeared slightly smoothed over, as if carefully abraded. The trail cam photos were the same ones, but slightly darker in contrast, making the figure even harder to discern. Someone wanted this evidence discredited without destroying it completely. The question was why, and who had the authority to make a seasoned deputy back away from a legitimate investigation? The first real snow came early that year, dusting the high peaks by mid-October. I watched the weather close in from my station window, knowing my patrols would get more challenging and more isolated with each passing storm. The shorter days meant longer nights in the forest, and something about the darkness felt different now. Heavier, more aware. I'd been a ranger, long enough to read the rhythms of these mountains. Every season had its patterns. Elk moving to lower elevations, bears making final foraging pushes before denning, small mammals catching their winter stores. But those familiar cycles were being disrupted. The usual morning chorus of birds would suddenly stop, like someone had flipped a switch. Deer trails I'd monitored for years showed signs of avoidance, with tracks detouring widely around certain areas. During one afternoon patrol near where I'd first found the tracks, I spotted a herd of elk on a distant slope. They were bunched tightly together, heads up, staring fixedly at a dense stand of timber. I raised my binoculars, following their gaze, but saw nothing but shadows between the trees. The elk stood frozen like that for nearly 10 minutes before, abruptly turning and moving off in the opposite direction. It wasn't predator behavior I recognized. No wolf or mountain lion would hold animals in place that long without making a move. The incident with the blood samples and altered evidence weighed heavily on my mind. If the creature I'd seen had been injured, was it now recovered? The ragged breathing I'd heard that night suggested serious distress. But in the weeks since, I'd documented signs of deliberate movement, strategic positioning that kept it just out of sight, but close enough to observe. On a particularly cold morning, I found fresh tracks in a light dusting of snow. They led in a straight line parallel to my own patrol route, about 50 yards off in the trees. The stride length was consistent, purposeful, showing no signs of limping or favoring one side. Whatever had made those prints was healthy enough to maintain a steady pace through difficult terrain. The feeling of being watched intensified with each passing day. I'd catch movement in my peripheral vision, only to turn and find empty forest. Sometimes, returning to my vehicle after a patrol, I'd find subtle signs that something had circled it while I was away. A few broken twigs, displaced gravel, that same musky scent lingering in the air. The silence became my constant companion, not the peaceful quiet of a winter forest, but an unnatural stillness that followed me like a bubble. No chickadees scolding from the branches, no squirrels chattering their warnings. Even the wind seemed to die away when that presence drew near. I began to understand that the silence wasn't just an absence of sound, it was a signal, a way of tracking the creature's movement through its effect on the forest itself. One evening, checking the closure gates on a remote fire road, I heard what sounded like wood knocking again, the same deliberate pattern I'd noticed that first night. But this time it came from 3 different directions, spaced evenly around my position. A form of communication, a way of coordinating movement. The strategic implications made me increasingly uneasy. This wasn't the behavior of a wounded animal seeking shelter. This was something else entirely, something intelligent enough to adapt its tactics, to observe and respond, to stay just beyond the reach of proof. I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew about these mountains. Had I simply failed to notice these patterns before, or had something changed, something that was now watching me as intently as I was watching for it? The forest I'd patrolled for 20 years felt suddenly unfamiliar, as if I was seeing it through different eyes. And somewhere out there, in the deepening winter shadows, I sensed those eyes were seeing me too. The snow had started falling again when my flashlight beam caught something white against the dark earth. At first, I thought it was just another patch of early snow, but as I drew closer, the shapes became clearer, bones, partially covered by soil and forest debris, arranged in what appeared to be a deliberate circle about 8 feet in diameter. My training kicked in, and I began documenting what I found. Most were clearly elk and deer remains, ribs, vertebrae, long bones stripped clean. But mixed among them were fragments I couldn't immediately identify, pieces too large to belong to any typical forest creature I knew. The arrangement wasn't random. The larger bones formed an outer ring, with smaller pieces laid carefully toward. The center 20 years of ranger work had shown me plenty of predator kill sites and scavenger dumps. This was different. No natural predator organizes its leftovers this way. Bears scatter their kills. Mountain lions cache their prey under brush. This had the deliberate feel of something. Collecting. I felt my heart rate quicken, but kept my movements steady and professional, taking photos and GPS coordinates. The ranger in me needed evidence, documentation, but another part of me, something more primitive, was screaming to leave this place immediately. The sun was setting early that December evening, painting the snow-covered ridge in deep blues and purples. I was finishing my patrol route, eager to get back to my truck before full dark, when movement caught my eye about 200 yards up the slope at first. I thought it might be an elk. The silhouette was dark and massive against the dimming sky, but as I raised my binoculars, my hands trembling slightly from more than just the cold, I saw it wasn't an elk at all. The figure moved on 2 legs with a slow, deliberate gait that seemed almost human, yet utterly wrong. It was huge. I estimated at least 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and long arms that swung with each step. What happened next froze me in place. The creature stopped mid-stride and turned its head toward me. Even at that distance, I felt seen, truly seen, in a way that sent ice through my veins. Those decades of ranger training, all my experience with wildlife and search and rescue, everything in me screamed to pursue, to investigate, to document, but something deeper, more primal, took control. I found myself backing away, step by step, until I turned and made my way quickly back to my vehicle. That silhouette, that deliberate turn of its head, it's burned into my memory forever. The next morning, I filed what might have been the most carefully worded report of my career. I kept it clinical, focusing on verifiable details: time, location, weather conditions. No speculation, no dramatic language, just the facts, stripped of anything that might raise eyebrows. Within a week, I submitted my request for reassignment to sectors closer to the main station. My supervisor approved it without question, perhaps relieved to avoid any further unusual reports from the backcountry. I never set foot in those remote canyons again, and honestly, I slept better for it. The official records from that period show nothing extraordinary, just routine patrols and standard observations. The deputy and I crossed paths occasionally at the station, but neither of us ever mentioned the plaster cast or that blurred trail camera image. His silence felt deliberate, protective even. Sometimes I wondered if he knew more than he let on, if there were other reports buried in files somewhere. Other rangers who'd seen things they couldn't explain. My own silence began to feel heavy, like I was part of something larger, a collective agreement to look the other way. Now, in 2023, I sit here recording these events, my hands shaking slightly as I speak into this microphone. 26 years of reflection haven't made things any clearer. Was I truly tracking an injured, extraordinary being that autumn, or did the isolation and exhaustion of those long patrols play tricks on my mind? I can't say for certain anymore, but I will say this: there are places in the San Juan National Forest that hold secrets, places where the rules we know bend and break. If you venture too deep into those remote canyons, you might find something that's been watching humanity for centuries, and once it knows you've seen it, that awareness never really fades. I still wake up sometimes, thinking I hear those deliberate knocks echoing across the valley. Thanks for watching. If any part of this story lingered with you, consider subscribing. I'll be here again tomorrow, sharing another tale that speaks to the soul.